Is the book full of plot holes, or are you just not paying attention? Hello and welcome back. My name is Mr. Sosotris, and this week I wanted to talk about the difference between objective and subjective book reviews, because I think that's something that a lot of people online get hung up on, and also it's something that's sort of affecting, sometimes negatively, the bookish landscape in general. So let's get into it. So the world of online book reviews has changed a lot over the years. For a while, the only place you could find book reviews was in periodicals, newspapers, magazines, and they were always sort of written by like professional journalists, and they had an editor, and sort of the version that went to print was a very polished kind of finished product. Book reviews now are a lot more off the cuff, they're a lot more common. Social media has made it very easy to share reviews. We've got sites like Goodreads and Storygraph where we can write our own reviews. There's a cat playing with a toy right there, that's why it's crinkling. And so the landscape is just very different now. I will say it's good that book reviews are more accessible now, because we're seeing lots more indie books being reviewed and a lot more diverse books being reviewed in general. Back in the day when it was just sort of, you would read the book reviews in the newspaper or magazines, there was a limited number of periodicals, and the books that they reviewed were oftentimes books that lots of people were already talking about. And so now we can review anything. We can review indie books, we can review really diverse books that really didn't get a spotlight before. So there is some good that's come out of the new landscape for book reviews. The downside comes from the fact that algorithms sort of determine everything now. Algorithms control trends and they control what we like. And so as a result, a lot of times people will write reviews in such a way as to game the algorithm itself rather than to write an honest review. And so what we see is books become either it's perfect, incredible, changed my life, amazing, or it's bad and I hated it and it's awful. There really is no middle ground, because algorithms reward hyperbole. They reward enthusiasm. And so if someone is talking about how this book is incredible, amazing, changed my life, amazing, 5 stars, I loved it, then that review is going to get more traction because, you know, it's more exciting and fun. And so we see this in other media too, in video games and movies as well. They aren't allowed to be like just enjoyable and good. You know, mid has kind of become a derogatory thing. If something is just okay, then that means that it's bad. You know, you can't have something that's okay and fun and does what it says on the box. You have to have something that's either incredible, mind-blowing, incredible, wonderful, perfect, or bad, evil, bad, wrong. You know, there's no middle ground, and so there's a lot of nuance that's lost. And so this loss of nuance has hurt book reviews, because a lot of times people see reviews itself as the content. And so it's more about like personalities, and yes, Hello Kitty. It's more about personalities. And so reviews are all about presenting an enjoyable review rather than presenting a review that provides information that is useful to readers. And so because of that, a lot of online bookish spaces, I'm thinking Tik-Tok especially, it becomes more a place for just enthusiastic personalities rather than a place for like meaningful discussion of books. Now there are corners of Tik-Tok where there are still good book reviews and meaningful discussion happening. So I'm not saying it's gone, but the big majority of Tik-Tok, when you first kind of go into Tik-Tok, you'll see kind of the same few books being talked about, and it's overwhelmingly a place of like personality over substance. And so you'll have lots of really fun, engaging people doing really funny reviews, but it's more about being a part of the crowd, being a part of the kind of in crowd that's talking about the popular books, and being a part of that. And I know that is exciting to be, you know, when you're talking about something that there's a fandom for and there's other people talking about the same thing and you can talk to them, like that's genuinely a lot of fun. But book reviews have kind of fallen by the wayside a lot of times because people don't really want, they don't have the attention span to devote their time to listening to like an insightful, detailed review. And not everyone wants to make super detailed, insightful reviews. Some people just want to give their thoughts, but even still, more thoughtful reviews where it's like, this is what I liked, this is what I didn't like, they don't really get a lot of traction because they're not exciting and punchy. And so people feel pressured to sort of exaggerate everything to make their reviews more exciting so that they can get views. And it's more about gaming the algorithm than it is about presenting honest reviews. And so as a result, a lot of reviews become very suspect. How many times have you seen someone or a bunch of people gushing about a book, enthusiastically talking about how it's incredible, it's so good, I loved it, it's amazing, 5 stars, and then you read it and it didn't really grab you. It wasn't really that exciting and you didn't really understand what the hype was all about. And so it was overhyped and it didn't work for you personally. That happens a lot. So how can we fix this? And I'm not saying this is something that's going to change overnight, because algorithms are always going to algorithm, and the majority of people are kind of in the grip of sort of chasing the algorithm because they want to get likes. That's what social media primarily is. But if you want something different, you can kind of carve out your own little corner of the book review spaces. And these are some things that we can do that can sort of inject some thoughtfulness into book review spaces. The big distinction that I think people need to be aware of is the difference between objective and subjective. Now, I will say right now, it is very, very difficult to provide a completely objective view of a book. There's scholars that can do really complex analyses of a book and dig into sort of how it works, the structure, the language, the character arcs, all that stuff, the themes, everything. And so it is possible to write objectively, but even an objective scholarly article about a book is going to have some subjectivity in it, because there's the things that they're specifically choosing to focus on. And also their interpretation sometimes might be sort of their own interpretation of a book. And so like, if there's very few books that I would be comfortable talking objectively about. One good example would be like the Odyssey. So I've read it a million times, and I recently did a deep dive on my Lit 101 series, and so I'm decently comfortable with talking about the Odyssey sort of semi-objectively, but even still, I had to reread it again before I did those videos and take notes just so that I could like really dig into all the stuff, because there's no way to read a book once and know everything about it. Be like, I've read it, I can sum up the entire experience of reading this book after having read it once. Another book that I think I'd be decently okay with talking about would maybe be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I've read it about 5 times, but again, if I wanted to do a really objective look at it, I would still want to reread it again and take notes again, even though I've done that before, because you really need to dig into something to really sort of get at the nuts and bolts of how it's working. It's really, really hard to read something once and then sort of know everything about it. Now, it is possible to do like a really close reading of something on a first reading. I did this a lot in grad school, where you don't have time to read a book a lot of times, and so you read it once, but you're taking notes the whole time. You're doing research into the background of the author, the time period, all that fun stuff. And it is possible to sort of get a fairly decent understanding of something just from reading it once. But even still, they always say, if you're going to write an article about a book, you have to have read it at least 3 times. You know, you read through it once, and then you read through it again a little bit closer, and then you read through it again, picking it apart. And, you know, after 3 passes, you're fairly comfortable. Think of like your all-time favorite piece of media. If it's a TV show or a book or a video game or something, and you've played it or read it or watched it like 10 times, and you've memorized parts of it, and you can quote it at will. If you've seen something that much, then you kind of can you really understand kind of everything about how it works and what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it. But it's not something that if you see a new show and you just watch it once and someone says, okay, could you write like an in-depth analysis the same way you could about your favorite show? The answer would be no, because you have to watch it over and over and over again to really get it, or to read it over and over again to really get it. Now, with that said, if you read something once and you bounce off of it because it didn't really work for you, that's still valid. Some books may have like flat characters, or it might be really repetitive, or it might have an ending that sort of comes out of nowhere, or it might have a writing style that just doesn't work for you, and that's totally fine. But we need to be aware that oftentimes those are things that we bounce off of because of our expectations and what we enjoy in a book, and it may not always mean that the book is objectively bad. So I have some examples. One good example is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, one of my favorite books of all time ever. Now, the characters in this book are fairly flat. We like the characters because of the movie version, and the actors who starred in the movie version did a really good job of making every single character unique and interesting and exciting and dynamic. And so because of that, when you read this, you can like picture the movie versions of the characters, and it's fine. But this is something that Michael Crichton has always kind of struggled with, and he got better at it in his later books. But for the most part, a lot of his characters are very, very flat. They're sort of cardboard cutout audience stand-ins, and a lot of times big swaths of his books involve characters getting sort of lessons in various branches of science. In this one, there's a whole section where they're talking about genetics, and Dr. Wu is a character, but he's just there as a source of information for our characters, and so he's explaining how they brought dinosaurs back to life, and our characters are asking questions, and we're fascinated because the subject matter is interesting and because it's well paced and well structured. But we don't read this because we think, I'm so invested in the inner lives of these characters, because that's not the focus, and that's okay. But I can see someone bouncing off of this because they said the characters were flat, it wasn't really what they were looking for, and that's a valid criticism. But it doesn't mean the book is like objectively a bad book. It just means that there's one thing that the book doesn't do well, and that one thing was important to the reader, which is fine. And so they chose not to invest a lot of attention into it because of that element didn't appeal to them, and that's fine. But that's a subjective opinion. Another example is Stephen King's The Stand. One thing that Stephen King does a lot is repetition. He'll have characters that have like stock phrases or catchphrases, and they use them a lot. Or it's like a repetitive action that they do over and over and over and over and over again, to the point where it can be almost annoying, but it fits in what he's doing. So anyone who's read The Stand, if I were to say, MOON, that spells fun, you know what I'm talking about, because there's a character who says that kind of thing all the time. He'll say MOON, that spells, and then whatever word he's talking about, because that's the only word he knows how to spell. And there's another character, I think is just in the expanded version, but there's another character who's like, how do you like that, happy crappy? And that's what he says all the time. He says it over and over and over and over and over again. And it's really repetitive. And so someone who read this, they might say, the characters just say the same things over and over and over again. You feel like you're surrounded by those toys with like this drawstring in the back, and you pull it and then they say the one thing over and over again. And so maybe that's something that they bounced off of. But Stephen King does that deliberately. All of his characters, the ones that are very repetitive in the things that they say, that is a part of their character. It says something about who they are. It reveals something about their quirks. People are very single-minded sometimes, and people can be very repetitive and predictable. And in chaotic situations where you have people facing, a global apocalypse, sometimes these people will fixate on things, and those repetitive things become like sources of comfort for them, and so they'll say their catchphrases over and over and over again because it's reassuring to have something familiar. So Stephen King uses that very specifically. Another thing that he does in The Shining is you'll have Jack, there's moments where he says like he he wipes his handkerchief across his lips, and he does that over and over and over and over and over again, to the point where you're like, why does he keep using this exact same phrase over and over again? But when you read it, you realize that what he's doing is, it's a nervous habit, it's a nervous tic, and he does that when he wants a drink, but he can't drink because he's an alcoholic, and if he drinks, he will fall down a very dark hole. And so every time he thinks about drinking, he wipes something across his mouth, and it becomes a nervous habit after a while, and then it becomes a little more sinister, because as the hotel sort of is getting in his mind and controlling him, the movement becomes less a nervous tic, and it becomes almost a sinister harbinger that he's losing himself. And so it works in the book, even though it's very repetitive, it functions to tell us about the character. And so I can see people reading Stephen King and being like, I really like his stories, but it's really repetitive, and a lot of the characters say or do the same thing over and over and over again, and I didn't really like that. And that's fine. You're okay to not like that, but be aware that that's a subjective opinion, and it doesn't mean that the book is objectively bad. And so I think one thing that would make book reviews work a little bit better is, instead of feeling pressured to say that a book was incredible, wonderful, 5 stars in order to convince other people to read it, because I feel like sometimes when you're doing reviews, that's what you feel obligated to do. It's like you want to present the book in the best light possible so that other people can read it, because maybe you want to support the author, which is fine. Maybe you want to talk to other people about the book because you really enjoyed it, and that's fine too. But you want to be honest about the things that you read. And so one thing that I think will help is, instead of feeling pressured to present every single book in like the most positive light possible, talk about the things that you really liked, the things that the book did that you liked personally. Be aware that it's a subjective opinion, but that's okay. It'll still help your readers. Talk about the things that the book did that you liked, the things that the book did that maybe didn't quite work for you, and maybe avoid giving the book a star rating if it doesn't really add anything to your story. Because sometimes I'll read a review or watch a review, and someone will be like, I gave this book 4 stars, and then they go on talking about it, and I realize that I didn't really pay attention to the number of stars. Like, it really didn't give me any information that was useful, because everyone's star ratings are so subjective anyways. And so I kind of blank that part out. I focus more on what's the plot about, what's the characters, what's the style, what things does it do well, what aspects does it highlight, that kind of thing. And so if you're more honest in your book reviews, and you are aware that if a book gets like 3 or 4 stars, that doesn't mean it's a bad book. It means that it did what it said, it was enjoyable, you read it once and you liked reading it, but you probably won't ever read it again. A book that's 5 stars is something that's like, it was incredible, you have to have it on your shelf, you want to reread it multiple times, you're like, it really, really affected you. And so if we're more honest about book reviews, and we're also aware that book reviews are subjective, and we don't try to present book reviews as presenting sort of objective truth, I think our reviews are going to be more meaningful. And I will admit, those probably won't catch on in the algorithm, but the people who do watch them are going to appreciate them. And so you're going to reach people who actually will gain something from your review, rather than just getting a lot of views just for the sake of it. We do need to be aware that there are objective things that a book can do poorly, but they're a lot less common than I think we think they are, because I think websites like CinemaSins have sort of affected our ability to engage with media in a meaningful way, because instead of just enjoying a book for how it affects us personally, we're sort of almost looking for the tropes and the plot holes. And so it's like we're expecting everything to be flawed, and so we want to look for the flaws. And so we'll find flaws where there isn't necessarily any. And so we'll be like, this is a plot hole, because we're really excited to have discovered a plot hole, when in reality, it's okay, kitty. When in reality, it just means that maybe it's something ambiguous that wasn't explicitly stated but is sort of implied, or it's something that we have to kind of connect the dots ourselves for it to make sense. And that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. But I mean, some books can have things that maybe objectively don't work. One good example of this is R.F. Kuang's Babel. Now, I really, really, really liked this book. I thought it was gorgeously written. It had some really incredible things to say about colonialism, and in today's landscape where so many people are sort of willfully ignorant of how colonialism works, I think she does a really good job of breaking it down in a way that sort of makes it very obvious what she's talking about. But I will say the finale didn't quite work for me. It felt a little too easy. There was some characters who had their minds changed a little too easily, and that didn't really ring super true. But apart from that, I think the book overall was very good. And so I'm not going to say, you know, this book is objectively terrible because it over-explains its main idea and the finale didn't quite work for me. But I'm going to say this is what I liked about it. This is what it did well. The characters, the character arcs are so good. The world building is good. The magic system is complex and interesting. And overall, I did have a really good time reading it. Overall, I think my opinion of this book is around like the 4-star range, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means I had a good time reading this, and it's okay for something to fit into that area. That doesn't mean it's bad. But I know some people are convinced that because the book does have a few flaws, that they want to say like, okay, well, the book is objectively bad. All of it is objectively bad, and R.F. Kuang's a bad writer, and the book doesn't work at all, when, you know, that's really, really melodramatic and kind of hyperbolic. And so you want to focus on, you know, the book does these things really well, the book maybe struggles at this thing, but overall my reading experience was good, and it's fine. I'll see people complaining about Wuthering Heights a lot because the language is a little obscure, it's very dense, and the main characters are all objectively pretty terrible people. There's not really any good people that we can sort of latch onto. All of the narrators are sneaky and manipulative in some way or another. And so, but we'll see people who would say like, you know, this is objectively a bad book because it's hard to understand and the characters are all bad people, so there's no one to look up to. And that is very much a subjective opinion. You can say, I didn't connect with any of the characters, and so I had a hard time getting into it. Or I had trouble with the language because it just didn't really work for me. I felt like it was a little too dense. And that's okay. That's fair. You can be like, you know what? I didn't really care for reading this. I'm going to try something else. That is completely okay. But when people then say, because of that, they say like, this is objectively a bad book and no one should read it because it's hard to read and the characters are bad, that sort of turns that subjective opinion into objective fact, and it does a disservice to the novel that has a lot of really complex, interesting things to say about human nature and abuse and cycles of violence and class distinctions, all that stuff. And so people need to be aware of the difference between objective fact and subjective opinion. And just because something is subjective, it doesn't mean it's wrong or bad. I think people feel defensive because they think that it's like, well, I didn't care for this because I had trouble reading it. Obviously, it's the internet. And so they think people are going to come in the comments of their video and say like, oh, you couldn't read Wuthering Heights, you're uneducated, and you don't know what you're talking about, and you're ignorant. And I get that. People online are very mean, and they can be very cruel. And you just have to not listen to the people who are intentionally cruel. If you can say, I didn't personally care for this, I'm sure others might like it, I didn't really care for it, that's fine, and that's a valid opinion. One book that I read recently was The Archive Undying by M.O. Miko Candon. Now, this was a DNF for me. The language is very beautiful and complex. The world building is great, but I couldn't follow the plot. This is very much a book where you're very much inside someone's head. He's an unreliable narrator, and he's keeping secrets from himself, and there's not really a good sense of like place or location. And so it just felt like sort of we're inside his head so much that I had no clue what was going on in the world around them. And this is a world with like giant robots fighting each other. And so I was like really excited about that. But the giant robots fighting each other always is sort of happening in the background while we're inside the main character's brain. Now, I DNF'd it and I said this didn't work for me, but I have read other reviews where a lot of people said that they really, really enjoyed it, and it was very rewarding once they got to the end, and the complexity of the internal kind of maze that you find yourself in is really interesting, and that's fair. So this is a book, I DNF'd it, but I probably will read it again because I might have just not been in the right mindset when I read it. But I'm not going to say this is objectively a bad book. I'm just going to say that it was a difficult book for me to read, and I'm going to try it again in the future. And that's okay. And so when you're writing reviews or you're making videos, just be aware that it's okay to embrace the subjective opinions. You are allowed to have opinions. You don't have to defend every review by saying this is objective fact, and if you argue with me then you're wrong and you're like a bad person and you hate me, because that is not how any of this works. You can say this is what worked for me personally, this is what didn't work for me personally. It's okay if you have different opinions, but this is sort of what I thought of it. And those subjective opinions are going to help your readers or your viewers more, because they're going to be like, okay, well, that's something that I personally don't enjoy, or that's something that I really enjoy, so maybe I'll give that a go. And I think we'll have more meaningful discussion about reviews. But again, there is lots of toxicity online, and then there's always the algorithm, which rewards sort of cheap and easy fun over meaningful depth. So if your goal is to have tons of followers and get 1 million views on all your videos, meaningful reviews are not going to do it. But I don't know. I feel like we have spent enough time being controlled by algorithms, and so we should just embrace having fun and just go with it. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.